Hi, I'm John Paul and a really warm welcome back to my channel. Today this is video 3 about red flags. In the first video in this series I talked about ideas about what red flags are and suggested 10 of them. The second one of course about why we might initially not even see them, and then if we do we might go on to endure or deny the red flags in relationship. And I hope from that what you'd have got is a sense of empathy for self actually, because there are so many reasons why human beings do that. But the thing about this is that it isn't inevitable that we have to do that anymore. A lot of what I was talking about in video 2 is about the reasons for not seeing it and then perhaps enduring or denying it, is that in the past we didn't have any option but to do that. And that's not something we have to do anymore. It's something that can, although change takes time and change is difficult and patterns are difficult to change, and I'm going to mention that throughout, what I'm going to be focusing on here in this video is about how we change the pattern within the relationships potentially, and also if we want to leave, just a few things about leaving the relationship. Because in any situation we have a choice of accepting something, changing it, which means changing ourselves within the dynamic because we can't change another person, or leave. So I'm going to be talking really about the changing and leaving here. As far as acceptance, what we accept is lots of red flags in the other person in a relationship, is that we accept a situation where there are significant obstacles to connection and love. They make the other person much more difficult to love, and they make it much more difficult for them to love us in the way that we might deserve and want and need in the relationship. So to accept that means to accept a life where actually, rather than relationships being some of life's best experiences, this relationship becomes one of our life's worst experiences. And as I've said, that's not an inevitable human experience. It may have been something that we had to exist within when we were growing up, but that's not the case anymore. I'm going to talk about 10 points here, which I think are a good idea to hold in mind. Okay, so just dealing with the 10 points, these aren't in any particular order. The first one, there is a Simone quote where she says, "You've got to learn to leave the table when love's no longer being served." And I think that's directly related to this situation. Is also, I'm going to say about leaving, I mean, it isn't necessarily leaving the relationship, although sometimes I think that is what needs to happen for someone, but only you can decide that. But you can leave a table that someone else has set, metaphorically, move to one of your own, and this is how you set it with your boundaries and your needs and your wants, and somebody can come and sit at yours. So I don't think this is all necessarily about leaving. There can be that process of change together within a relationship if people are working together in order to do that. And as I've said, I will talk about that as well. But the thing what I wanted to focus on in this first point is the point about when love is no longer being served. Love, our definition of that and what was modelled throughout early experience is what we're going to have internalized about what love is. And I think that can be a real difficulty here, is we say to somebody, you've got to leave if somebody's not being loving, but actually what we've been shown is loving, what we think and believe is loving, cognitively even, but also in our bodies, was not loving. So I think the first most important thing is for us to cognitively think about what is loving behaviour. And I've drawn the distinction in past videos in this series about the kind of love and attachment underneath, but then on top, how loving is somebody. Being loving are qualities being demonstrated, aren't they? Well, some of the key ones which I've talked about are people who will pay attention to you. That is loving. Empathy is loving. So using their imagination to imagine what you might feel like in a situation is empathy. Somebody who sees you, hears you, validates your feelings, does not put your feelings above theirs, but is aware that your reality, that includes your felt experience of things, is of equal worth and value to theirs. I think those are all loving in relationship. So here, I think what we need to do is cognitively know what constitutes love for us now from this point on. There is this thing about love hurts. People will have been told that love hurts. Actually, I don't think it's love at all that hurts. Love is a feeling that people pursue relentlessly because they feel whole themselves and have great self-esteem when they're in that loving part of self. they love others, they feel connected to the environment. Largely everything feels good in the world when we're in that part. It isn't love that hurts, it's the things that people do around it. So they get angry, try to dominate, get jealous, heartbreak, cheat, lie. It's those things which hurt, actually. And of course, they're all part of relationships to a greater or lesser degree for people, because we're all human. If we're going to orientate ourselves here in terms of love, it is that love doesn't hurt. It's the things that people do around love, because we're human and because we grew up in environments where we got traumatized and perhaps there was a lack of real love. It's those sorts of things that people do that hurt. You know, more generally, growing up in the kind of environments that I described in video 2, where people blamed you for saying, look, I don't like this environment, I have a problem with this. Conditional love that was given to you, potentially, which meant that you hid your feelings, that you were told that you were selfish to have needs and wants, or to get angry or to get fearful, and nobody helped you with that. Those are very disorientating experiences. What I mean by that is they adversely affect our internal compass. And I think our internal compass, the two key components of that are going to be what we think, that kind of paradigm there of our rules of relationship, what we believe is loving, what we will tolerate, what we won't, how we express things, what are our boundaries. And the other fundamental component of all those things is the information that comes from our emotion experience, our bodies. And I think the experience of being within a family environment, for example, where it was an imperative, but when my happiness is only dependent on theirs, you know, I'm happy if you're happy, I'm unhappy if you're unhappy, is that we get disorientated and our internal compass isn't working in the way that it might be. So this first point is about specifically in relation to love, because that's the key thing which most of us are looking for from relationships, is to make sure that cognitively we are orientating ourselves around a definition of love and hold an internal definition of love that we're comfortable with, that meets our needs in any given situation. Other people may have a different definition, other people may look for different qualities, but largely actually most people would say similar things as far as love. I do talk about it in my book, Finding a Balanced Connection, and also the course, Life Unlimited. So what is love? Cognitively, thoughts-wise for us. What is loving behaviour? What are the qualities that need to be demonstrated? What does empathy sound like? Empathy sounds like something. Attunement to you sounds like something. Seeing and hearing you sounds like something. And I mean all of you, if we're looking at, you know, intimacy, vulnerability in relationship, not just particular aspects that are acceptable, because as I said in video 2, a lot of people's experience was that there was a very conditional love. So it was okay if they were happy or excited, but not if they were angry or fearful or hurt. So I think it's paying attention here to how somebody relates to all of you. And this idea that love is an emotional skill that I talked about as well, is that emotional skill being demonstrated behaviourally, verbally in the other person. Just, I suppose, to demonstrate this idea of, are we, you know, holding love and loving qualities in mind when we're looking at and for people to bring into our lives. Look, I understand this isn't things on TikTok aren't some kind of scientific study in this situation, but there is a TikTok that recently went viral, which was a woman saying, I'm looking for a man in finance with a trust fund, 6'5", blue eyes. And that was that. Now, I think things tend to go viral on TikTok because they resonate with people. And what you can see there is she's looking for someone in finance. What would that be about as far as needs being met? It could be perhaps protection, it could be provider. Of course, somebody in finance has qualities that could very much be connecting qualities as well. But what is the top value there? Trust fund, again, protection, provision maybe. 6'5", blue eyes is about somebody's physical appearance, perhaps sexual attraction, perhaps protection. I just don't hear anything which is about necessarily, explicitly loving qualities. And in fact, if somebody's very driven, really pushed themselves through in careers and able to do that, really moved their frame through in times at the expense of others, you know, winning is important, the next thing is important. As I mentioned in previous videos, that can actually be a contra indicator for somebody having connected, loving qualities. Of course, I'm sure there are plenty of people within finance or wherever in corporate careers that are also very connected too. But I think if what we want is a long-term relationship, where in whatever context that remains connected, where somebody can regulate themselves, where somebody knows how to repair something, where somebody's anger is under conscious management, as is their fear, as is their competitive part, as I mentioned in previous videos, those I would have thought need to be tagged on the end of what we're looking for. Because also there was a follow-up viral video to that where there was a woman filming a man on a laptop saying this is the reality of a man in finance, etc., etc., at 7:30 when we're meant to be on holiday together. And I'm not pervasively sweeping across and saying this is what all relationships of people in finance and people who aren't. What I've said in previous videos and what I believe is that we can only be in one place at a time. So somebody's primary relationship could be with pushing forward their career and making more money. They can't at the same time be very connected and thinking about repair. It's their reality and their needs and their wants that are prioritised in that moment. Of course, they may be doing that for others. They'll probably say they're doing that for family and others. But largely, the reality that's being moved forward is their own and their own values and their own needs and wants. And it means that relationships, romantic relationships and other relationships, unless somebody can switch gears between that place of drive and the place of connection, their relationships are always going to be a sideshow. You are always going to be a sideshow to that person. And I think that's what's literally demonstrated in that video, isn't it? It's somebody filming someone whose primary relationship is with whatever is going on that laptop, whilst they're meant to be on holiday in relationship with their partner. So I've said it a number of times, just to make sure that if you want to avoid these red flags, that we have a clear idea of what loving qualities look like, of what loving behaviours are. Then moving on to the second one here. I think if we're going to identify these red flags, we need to listen to other people, the other person, really carefully. I talked in previous videos about what love and imagination does. It tends to fill in gaps. We tend to hear what we want to hear. We imagine the person is who we want them to be. We imagine also potentially that they continue to be the person that they were when they initially fell in love, if we're looking at romantic relationships. But I've also talked about that love in imagination will fill silences, for example, in with the fact that they are present, those thought patterns of somebody, but they're just not somehow explaining it because they're stressed or they find it difficult to express themselves emotionally. So if we're looking at empathy, for example, which to me would be a key component of being loving or a loving quality being demonstrated, empathy sounds like something. If you're telling a story about somebody in your life with, say, your partner, if they are going to empathize with that person, it will sound like something about how difficult it must be for that other person, for example. Now, if there's an absence of that, of course it might be that they're distracted or thinking about other things in that occasion. It may also be that they don't have those pathways. There are plenty of people who are not using their imagination to imagine what somebody else's reality is like. They don't place that much importance on other people's realities, save to the extent that that other person can meet their needs, their drives. So I think it's important here, yes, to be listening to the things that people say as an indicator of red flags, but also to listen for the things that they don't say as well, because that can very much indicate it's an absence of attunement. It could be an absence of empathy. It could be an absence of placing importance on your reality, whether that's your emotional experience or your intellectual experience or whatever. So it could be an absence of that. It's not just the things that people say, it's also the things that they're not saying. So I think it's important to really pay attention to words or lack of words, really important to pay attention to behaviours or lack of behaviours. And I think we need to make sure we're not either tuning them out, as we may have done or had to do in early experience, so looking away, denying, focusing on the positive things in them, or of course catastrophizing, because that can be a problem too. I'm going to come on to communication and change and the importance of not catastrophizing in a situation, because I think the trouble with catastrophizing with red flags is that we tend to feel very unsafe and might approach things therefore with anger, which is probably not going to get our need met in that situation. As far as tuning them out, we don't want to make the reasons for someone being consistently stressed or irritable or not paying attention excuses. So So what I mean by that is if the reason that somebody is not paying attention or doesn't seem to place that much importance on your reality, on your day, if the reason for that is that they're stressed, that is a reason, isn't it? But it isn't an excuse, because the trouble with excuses as far as red flags is they're generally full stops. Well, they're stressed, they're having a busy day at work, or they've got a very demanding job, that kind of thing. And that is a reason why people may demonstrate red flags as a pattern. But of course, if we want to do something about these red flags, we don't want things to end there. We need to look at why somebody has such a stressful job, because of course if they continue to do that, if they continue to take on all these things that may say something about their own boundaries, their relationships are always going to be a sideshow. They're always going to suffer, and that's probably not something that they want either in life. So we can definitely look at reason, but I don't think it's a good idea for love to make them excuses and therefore full stops. Carrying on from this idea about loving and paying attention, it's of course listening to the words that somebody's saying or not saying with the kind of cognitive idea of love and loving qualities that we now have and are developing. And also, incredibly importantly here, the other part of it, of course, is listening with our bodies. So when somebody's talking, when we're in relationship with somebody, listening from a cognitive point of view, passing things through that paradigm of love that we now have, and also being attuned to our own emotional experience. As I've talked about in previous videos, being in an environment where we were forced to only be happy if they were happy and to be unhappy if they were unhappy, our separate emotional experience of the world, we just often lose touch with it. Our compass becomes very outward in terms of emotion. It's not primarily fed by our own thoughts, by our own paradigm and our own emotional experience. So there is, through this process, if we're looking at anybody in our lives, starting new relationships with people, but anybody in our lives in existing relationships, is listening with our bodies to them. What does it feel like to be around them? If somebody's not attuning to you or not empathetic towards you, that's going to feel like something in your body. Those kind of red flags are going to feel like something: frustration, annoyance, hurt. Just as green flags of being seen, heard, validated, loved feel like something in the body too. So it's knowing what in the body the red flags feel like, and it's knowing what in the body the green flags feel like as well. Your body will feel their ambivalence. Your body will feel their 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Your body will feel the breadcrumbing when somebody's just occasionally dropping messages that they're into it, but actually they're not. Behaviourally, consistently, that's going to feel like something for you. When somebody fails to place enough importance on your reality and your emotional experience, that feels like something, and particularly confusing. I was talking about in an earlier video, those people that are very good at engaging with that connecting part, that love part, in order to get their needs met. So they know how to do it in order to get supply, but it doesn't really go anywhere heartfelt for them. It doesn't really have legs or is embodied, that love. And those people can be very confusing because they can say all the right things at particular times for you, but I think your body will tell you. Your emotions will tell you there. And it's very important, of course, isn't it, to be able to orientate ourselves in this way, both with our thoughts and with our body, in the face of somebody as well who may absolutely believe their own hype. So that if you look at somebody who's more kind of grandiose in terms of narcissism, where those traits are turned up high, they will absolutely believe that they are the best partners because they see things in terms of a victim-perpetrator scenario. Of course, when somebody challenges them or criticizes them, they become a victim in that situation, and the other person becomes a perpetrator and crazy or mad or overly emotional. They will most often believe they're in the right. Sometimes might deliberately be saying that, but often it's just how they relate to the world. They can't see or take responsibility for their own part in things and actually think they're pretty amazing as far as partners, and that can be very disorientating and confusing. And the only way you're going to know there really about what the reality of it is, well, what your reality of it is what you feel in response to them, when you talk to them, when you're listening, when you hear the things that they say, when you see the behaviours they engage in. I mentioned the importance of listening there, and just to say a bit more about that, if somebody's much more empathetic generally, and they've, for example, got into a relationship with somebody whose narcissistic traits up high, the more empathetic person might be much more psychologically minded, much more curious about self, much more used to being self-reflective. So if there's a conflict situation or difficulty, thinking, well, what is my part in it? In a way that the person with, say, grandiose narcissistic traits is rarely going to do that. But what can happen with very empathetic people, if they're used to explaining things a lot and talking about psychological concepts, is they can do a lot of talking in relationships. And because it makes perfect sense to them, and they think that if they say it, because the other person is receptive in the way that they're probably receptive to psychological concepts and change, they believe that if they've said it somehow, it's going to be internalized by the other person and it's going to change. And I don't think that's always the case. You know, some people have highly narcissistic traits that it's a real obstacle to taking anything in. They're really not porous to other people's views and concepts. There's a strong component of these narcissistic traits up high is that they know. They've often gone through in terms of career, you know, they are the expert. They're not used to being in a situation where they don't know, or they need to be open to take in other people's ideas, which, by the way, can make therapy quite difficult. So just to emphasize this real listening point, because what we don't want, I guess, is a situation where we're feeding all the lines and somebody's just saying, yes, okay, yes, I will do that. Yes, you're right. Yes, I understand. Some people do that. If somebody's got highly narcissistic traits, they will just be parroting something back in order to move the conversation on or to move the argument on. They actually place very little importance on it. They don't really care. So what the important thing is there, as I say, is what they actually say, is listening for the things that they actually say. If you're looking at couples counselling, relationship counselling, what can happen a lot in that is somebody talks and then the other person repeats back what that person says. Because sometimes people, their psychological structure means they don't listen very much to other people. Yes, they can look like they are and they can repeat something back when they've heard it, but have they actually formed that empathy pathway, for example? Have they actually realised how important it is to you and really felt it, not just cognitively, but also emotionally felt how important it is to you and how much distress you're in, that they are invalidating your emotion experience, that they're not placing sufficient importance on your reality? That sounds and looks like something. So I think it's important to pay attention to that. Just some specific things to listen for and look out for. As I've talked about in previous videos, you know, how does somebody manage their feelings? What's their relationship with their feelings? Do they reflect? As with all these things, and I'm going to talk about it with change, all human beings are going to come into relationship with some form of difficulties, with something that could constitute red flags. It's not that people have them, I think, that's the difficulty, depending on what they are, of course. But most of the kind of absence of things, the sort of absence of love, growing up in environments where somebody didn't attune to them, didn't empathise with them, and then they are living in the backlash of that, and therefore you are. Those things can be different with self-reflection, with conscious work, and I will come on to that. Empathy can be learnt. As I said, love is an emotional skill. Those skills can be learnt. But do they self-reflect? At some point, are they curious about themselves and how things are working? At some point. Another interesting one to listen out for if we're talking about romantic relationships here, I think, is how do they characterise their exes? I think that that's interesting from the point of view of the responsibility and somebody's self-awareness in relationship. Some people, perhaps people who have these highly narcissistic traits, will often characterise their exes as mad or crazy, and you may not have ever met their exes, so maybe their exes did have significant distress. Not that I would ever characterise somebody as mad or crazy, but they may have had significant psychological distress. But at the very least, I think, you know, what was that person's part? They continued in relationship where somebody was in that situation. You know, how did that happen? Again, it's this point about self-reflection, about curiosity, about taking some accountability and responsibility, not blame, as I said before, but accountability and responsibility. Another thing just to say here is listening and watching out for what people do around humour. I'm going to talk about it below again in another point as well. A lot of people have learnt to laugh about things around emotional distress or around anger as well, smile when they're angry, which diminishes, unfortunately, and avoids the emotional reality of a particular situation. It was Stephen King, I think, that said that humour is almost always anger. with its makeup on. So in terms of red flags, and I was talking about anger being one of those red flags, I mean, some people act out their anger, which is very easy to see. But sometimes people communicate their anger. Often men, there's this kind of banter thing that's around at the moment for people. Often I think that can be communicating anger. It can be a way of demeaning somebody, being sarcastic, passive aggressive, those kind of things. So I would listen out for that too. Because I think the trouble with anger being communicated in some sort of banter is that, again, it adds to the disorientation, doesn't it? Humour is just the most wonderful connecting thing. It's a sign of connection. It's a way to get people to connect. But plenty of people are cloaking anger and frustration in humour. So I would listen out for what people do with that. I've actually recorded a video about banter in corporate environments, and that's specifically in corporate environments, but it does explain in that a bit about what I think can also be happening within humour that is banter. So you might want to take a look at that here. And I know, of course, for all the reasons that I've talked about in the second video, how hard it is to look at this objectively and this person objectively. The thing that I would say there is that try to imagine that the things were being said, not said, the behaviours were being engaged in, or there's this lack of behaviour by somebody who you were either neutral about or didn't like. So imagine that person, and then imagine those words coming from them, or imagine that behaviour coming from them. I think can be quite a helpful thing here, to use our imagination in that way. So perhaps we can be sort of looking at the reality of somebody rather than who our love and we want them to be. And the third one here, of course, those first two are really about looking and listening in relation to the other person. This one, very importantly, is looking at our own past and how we relate and what our values are and what our self-esteem is like. This isn't a blame thing, but if we're finding ourselves repeatedly in relationships with people where there are all these red flags and very few green flags, there is a reason why we're familiar with it. There's a reason why we continue to do it. There's a reason why we endure it. So I think we really need to understand what our psychological shape is there, and we can do that in all sorts of different ways. Therapy is one of the ways that we can do that, of course, but books, podcasts, all those kind of things help us here, I think. If we're looking at the example of somebody with highly narcissistic traits, most of us would believe that we're highly empathic, and that's the reason why the grandiose narcissist was attracted to us, and that's the reason we got into a relationship with them. And that may very well be the case. It is a great coupling, isn't it? Where you have the provide, protect, the person who's quite narcissistic, and there's a lack of genuine, heartfelt empathy. They're very drawn to people who occupy that place of heartfelt empathy a lot. And vice versa, I guess. Somebody who has a lot of heartfelt empathy, who may have been in that place at the expense of their own protection at times, might admire the quality of protection in somebody who has highly narcissistic traits. They may also admire the kind of material status and wealth that can come with that person who has highly narcissistic traits. So definitely, it may be that I'm drawn to narcissistic people and they're drawn to me because I'm an empath. There is also the possibility that I might also be a little bit more similar to them than I think or that I feel. There are people that are more covertly narcissistic. There is now a concept of echoist people as well. So I just think that's important to know, isn't it? Why did this fit together? Yes, there is absolutely, as I was talking about earlier, they were different and we were different when we first met. There may also have been signs that was there, and yet we continued despite it. And this isn't in any way from a blame point of view. It's just being curious about why it did work, why we continue to do it. We might, for example, place as much value on the material status and wealth as they might. That might be a similarity that we would have with them. Because of our empathy, of course, there isn't the kind of cruelty or manipulation or exploitativeness that can come with highly narcissistic traits, but we may share the kind of protection and provide value with them. The fourth point, just continuing on from this idea that, looking at ourselves and our part in all this and our own psychological makeup and structure, if we've had a tendency to mould or orbit around somebody who has, for example, highly narcissistic traits, I think we're going to struggle to change that, and certainly we're going to struggle to leave any situation where that's the case if we don't turn attention towards ourselves and our lives more generally outside of the relationship too. What can happen, as I said, with the kind of moulding and orbiting around conflict, external conflict, which can often happen with people with these highly narcissistic narcissistic traits. They're very drawing on our energy. Conflict, fear, anger are very sticky. There can be a primary preoccupation for someone on a thought, feeling, even behavioural level, and they may be talking to other people about the relationship all the time and getting angry and exasperated. The difficulty with that, of course, is to orbit around and have the state of mind of somebody who is highly narcissistic consistently visited on us by orbiting around in anger, frustration, confusion. That can stop us doing all these other things in life that are going to help us to feel safe and fulfilled. And that's for two reasons. It's important that we're looking at those other things in life just to be happy, fulfilled human beings. And also, if we're ever going to leave the person with highly narcissistic traits, if that's what you choose to do, you need to feel safe enough in the world that you have good foundations, both internally and also externally in relationships and, a job that you love and creative and connections to loving people, that you feel safe enough to do that. Because a lot of the reason that I think people stay with highly narcissistic people, as I've talked about in the second video, is fear. It's really looking at, are we planting our own garden, metaphorically? Are we decorating our own soul? Plant your own garden, decorate your own soul is in a poem which is about leaving somebody actually in the end of a relationship. So as much as we kind of preoccupy and talk about, and that's important, isn't it? Whether that's in therapy or with friends, to be talking about the person and their psychological shape and how we might relate to them in a way that is going to better get our needs met, and equally looking at our psychological shape. And as I just said, why somehow that has fitted together, or not fitted together, but remains. I think also more widely, we need to be looking at our own self-esteem, our trust in others, how trustworthy other people are in our lives as well. We really need to have other sources of green flag love in our lives. That's not just connection with other people, that's also connection to the environment, creativity, perhaps spiritual practices. All those kind of things help people feel much safer in themselves and the world, and not just safer, but, a truly lived, loved life. And I think that's a much better place from which to come a change with the kind of red flag person, or also leave. Somebody is unlikely to leave if they're going to be falling into the abyss, either in themselves or in the world generally, if that's how they see it. So I think we really need to be looking, our own part in things, our own psychological shape, our empathy. Do we empathize with others at our own expense? And as I've said, where the other sources of love, creativity, connection, all these great experiences are in life for us. Specifically on others, do go towards the warmth, I would say, with people. Where are these green flag people? What is empathy? Being seen, heard, people that really love you, people that really show and demonstrate love, people with whom you can really breathe, grow, connect, finding them and knowing what they feel like. And there is an Indian proverb which is that all the flowers of tomorrow are in the seeds of today. And that's what I'm talking about here, as I say, is planting your own seeds in whatever context that means in life. And they will over time develop into flowers. They will over time develop into things that give you joy. At number 5, I just wanted to draw a bit more here on the idea of humour and how we may have learnt in and throughout early experience or school years, whatever it might be, not to take our emotional experience seriously, learn to laugh at things which perhaps aren't really funny on an emotional level. It's all very confusing. It's all very disorientating for people. People will have learnt to laugh at having their emotions validated. They'll have learnt to laugh at somebody not placing importance. They'll have learnt to laugh at criticism or somebody being horrible to them. They don't feel it. It's confusing. You can see if somebody is laughing whilst annoyed, there is definitely a disconnection between that facial expression and what they're actually feeling. There's a real incongruence between the two, but a lot of us have learnt to do that. And I think it's confusing because, of course, laughing is about joy and happiness. So we're kind of smiling, which is about joy and happiness, but actually the thing that's happening or we're hearing or what we're feeling is totally in contradiction with that. So I would watch what you do with humour generally, and also what the people around you are doing with humour generally. Again, this idea of what if that thing was being said by someone who you didn't really like very much, and what if it was being said by somebody who you didn't really like very much to someone that you love. I think those are important ways to use the imagination here to really discriminate between, is this thing funny, or is this thing that somebody's expecting you to find funny, or you've learnt to find funny, actually funny. There's humour used all the time, and for great reason, in the therapy room, in relationships generally, as I've said. But I would say if you're looking at emotional experience being invalidated, or somebody being highly critical consistently, those things are serious and need to be taken seriously. Your emotional experience, your happiness, that you are or you're not getting the love that you deserve and want in relationship is serious. And I think even if somebody is not going to take that seriously, or has learnt not to, or not place much more importance on it, or laugh it off, I think we need to make it clear that it's serious to us and that we place significant importance on it. You know, this idea that emotions are not a luxury, they're a complex aid in the fight for existence. So somebody expressing their emotions, they may have been told that they're overly emotional or oversensitive, and therefore that emotions aren't really that important. And that's what's happened, isn't it? They weren't during early experience. They had to be moved out of the way in order to keep somebody else happy who our survival depended on. So they were really a luxury, or treated as a luxury. But as I've been saying here in this video and throughout in other videos as well, we don't exist if our emotions are invalidated. We exist cognitively, we exist for the other person to the extent we do things for them or meet their needs, but we don't exist as a separate person, potentially, unless they like the emotion, of course, but we don't exist as a separate person within the relationship if they do not place importance, or we do not place importance, on our emotional experience, as well as our intellectual experience and our behaviours, and the full range of our emotional experience there. If somebody doesn't care about them, laughs at them, they deny a fundamental aspect of your existence. You exist to the extent that you align with them or mould around them, and that's not really living, I don't think. And it's not necessary anymore. Just some more on change here. I was talking about, you've got to learn to leave the table when love's no longer being served, and said then that it doesn't necessarily mean leaving the relationship. As I said, I will come on to that. But if we're looking at change within the relationship, what we can do is reset the table, move to another table, put it in the way that we might want, of course, with the other person's input, and then we both sit at a table that we're much happier with, that's a table that has our reality and our needs and wants taken into account, and also has theirs. But I think if we're going to do that, a key component of it is going to be communication. And just to say a couple of things about this here, as I've said earlier, some people might be over-communicating in relationship with somebody who, say, has quite narcissistic traits, and some people will have learnt to under-communicate. Maybe they go between both. But I just wanted to say a bit more about both those situations, both under and over-communicating. As far as under-communicating, the environments we grow up in, as I said, we'd learnt to hide certain things. It was essential in order to do that, really, for our brain's point of view, for our survival there, and certainly to thrive and have any kind of love from caregivers. That very conditional love. So people will have learnt to hide what they feel. And if we haven't really communicated what we think and feel, if, as I've said, we even come away from even knowing what we think and feel, the next stage, as I've said, is to come back into contact with it, isn't it? And then it's to communicate it, and to communicate it in a way that is most likely to get our need met. The way we exist, the way we put in boundaries, the way we show that we are a separate person to the other person and of equal importance, and that we value our own emotional experience, is to communicate that. So for people that have hidden in that way, there is getting used to now speaking up in these relationships. And I think that can be very difficult from 2 points of view there. Firstly, to know what to say, but also if it's something that feels very unsafe, where they've been made to feel unsafe about speaking up about their feelings and making it clear because somebody in the past has either got very angry or withdrawn love, people's fight or flight part will go off when they try to say something to somebody. But there is this thing, say it even if your voice shakes. And your voice shakes there, reflecting the part that it's understandable for human beings in these sorts of situations that you may get very nervous saying something which is very new, particularly when the consequences in the past have been that there's been a withdrawal of love. But if somebody really loves you, genuinely loves you, they won't withdraw love. There is nothing that you could say, apart from you don't want to be in the relationship, I guess, but there's nothing that you could communicate that can ruin a real connection. So I suppose for the under-communicators, the people that have got used to not doing it in the past for good reason, there is a real journey here as far as doing it. I think it's Peter Bromberg that says when we avoid difficult conversations, we trade short-term discomfort for longer-term dysfunction. So if we're not communicating what we need and want, yes, we avoid the fear that comes with saying it, but the longer-term dysfunction, I'm not very keen on the word, but you know what I mean, the longer-term dysfunction unfortunately remains and will continue to be there. The narcissistic person may not care very much about how you feel. But what's important to show and we can do with communication is that we do, is that you care how you feel. And I think there are definitely ways that communication can be easier. It's a good idea to think about it, what we would say, to practice that. Therapy can be a good place to do that. Actually, again, my book, Finding a Balanced Connection, and also the course, Life Unlimited, both of those contain a chapter which is about how we can communicate something in a way that's more likely to get our needs met, to put in boundaries. So that's the idea of under-communicating. I've already said about the over-communicating that somebody who's very empathetic might do. It makes perfect sense to them to explain lots of things, these concepts as far as psychology and how relationships work and the importance of being seen and heard. They have an understanding and appreciation of that and might be talking a lot about it. And they think because it's been said by them that it's been said by the other person or heard by the other person. I think that's not always the case. So just to re-emphasize that listening to what the other person's saying. And the other difficulty was starting to communicate things when we haven't been used to doing that here. If we're looking at somebody who, for example, is quite narcissistic, I've already said it can trigger people's fight or flight. They feel nervous anyway. And of course, if you're talking to somebody who's in that highly narcissistic place, as soon as you start saying something that you would like to be different, they will likely perceive it as criticism. So it is that victim-perpetrator scenario. You very quickly, almost immediately, go to that place of perpetrator. If you're not with them, you're against them. So we're in a situation where we're feeling nervous saying it, possibly, and somebody has said, you're picking on me or you're criticizing me, you're taking me for granted. And because somebody might be feeling unsafe anyway, because they're not used to communicating their feelings, they might quickly go to anger themselves or get frustrated, get exasperated, get annoyed. And then, of course, their fight gets triggered and then they do start to criticize the person who's narcissistic. And then you're in that constellation feeding into that belief that they have that people who aren't with them are against them. And you become the problem there from their point of view. So I suppose here just to say the importance of communication there, and also the importance of making sure that we are remaining in balance to the extent that we can when we are trying to communicate something. We don't want to avoid something through our fear. I guess we also don't want to be jumping on things and catastrophizing and becoming verbally abusive in the face of their continued failure to take any sort of responsibility or accountability. So always working on keeping in this place of balance ourselves generally in life and whatever does that for you, because that's the place where it's much easier to be assertive, to communicate our needs, our wants, to be aware of our needs and wants, and to put in our boundaries that clearly make us exist as a separate person. Next, point 7. This isn't something that I would say to people. I wouldn't give advice about timing when they ought to do something in life and relationships. But I did hear somebody say to date a year before you make any significant changes in life. And I think that's probably taking into account what I talked about in the previous video, which is about if you're looking at romantic relationships, both people are not really who they're probably going to be on an ongoing basis in the relationship after that initial period of falling in love. So to make significant life decisions on the basis of that initial period, which is really artificial, I think, might be something to think twice about. As I say, that I wouldn't be suggesting how long somebody should wait before they do anything in relationship, but I can really see why somebody suggests to wait a particular period before you make very significant life changes. The next one, number 8, making sure that we're talking to trusted other people throughout. As far as these red flags, where they're present, as I've said in the previous video, what some people might do through shame is to start isolating. They might start not telling other people and hiding. They might be used to hiding things. They're being told that there's something wrong with them, possibly, if they're in relationship with somebody who is narcissistic, so they're disorientated possibly anyway. So people can start or stop talking to other people. Now, I use the word trusted here, trusted other people, or you might say trustworthy other people psychologically for important reason, because of course there will be lots of other people in the world who their compass has been set within these kind of challenging environments too. They may very much be encouraging you to look away from red flags, or even say, despite the existence of them, you have to stay because that's the commitment you've made. There are all kinds of people with all kinds of different views, of course, and we're all entitled to our views and opinions about relationships and red flags and what's green flags and whether somebody should stay. But I think in terms of, trustworthy other people, from this point of view, they will be kind and caring and empathetic. So they'll be in that connection part. I also think they won't overlook protection, because that is something that very much can happen. I talked about it previously. Loving people always persevere, always trust. I think they can do that at the expense of their own protection, and perhaps some people are used to doing that. And if you're talking to somebody who's used to doing that here, you will think you're a bad person for criticizing your partner or wanting there to be a change. You will think you're being unkind. So it's that situation again with others, isn't it, that we form our own view of things and we are informed by others. Not that our compass, our paradigm in situations like this or any situations in life are entirely formed externally by other people. And the reason I mention that as well, of course, is because that's what we may have been used to in early experience, entirely outward in, externally informed as far as what we should and shouldn't do. I think it's important we discriminate when we're talking to others about what's coming in and really judge it against our own internal compass here. If it doesn't feel like somebody who seems to be very kind and loving is not very protective, it may very well be because that's what they've got used to doing themselves. And it may be that you no longer want to remain empathetic and ever hopeful and ever trusting in another person at your own expense. Just the last 2 points, 9 and 10. Number 9 being about the possibility of change, and then 10 just talking about situations of leaving here. As far as change being possible, with all of the fears that even somebody remains in these situations, becomes hopeless and helpless, gets depressed, because agency over their lives seems to sit outside. They don't seem to be able to make changes to get out of the relationship with the person, or as I say, change, because perhaps they're in relationship with somebody who's highly narcissistic and is really going to struggle to change. People can just get very fearful, very angry, and at times experience themselves as hopeless and helpless. So I just wanted to say here how it's very much possible that, of course, these changes can be made within relationships. The vast majority of people come into relationships, as I've already said, with some forms of difficulties, with some obstacles to connection, even if they didn't, from early experience, had well-loved brains or have earned that sort of love of themselves and trust in themselves and the world. There are all sorts of things that are going to be going on in the present moment in life which are going to be disconnecting people. But if there are these sort of ingrained problems that people come into the relationship with, it is absolutely possible that those can be different, as long as there is self-reflection and curiosity on that person's part, and a proactive, active building into their life, perhaps on a daily basis or a weekly basis, whether that's from a thought, feeling, behavioural, bodily point of view, relationships with others, more connecting practices that are going to move these red flags out of life and move more green flags into life. That is absolutely possible, I believe, for all human beings. I'm in an industry that's entirely based on hope, knows how plastic, as far as human beings' brains are, knows how plastic we are, knows as well, as I've talked about in other videos, my belief that fundamentally people are always going to be moving or wanting to move towards that place of connection. Once the protection need is met, once the provide need is met, we always move to that place of wanting to love and be loved, and I mean really love and be loved. I sit with people hour after hour, day after day, where people are doing that. It's incredibly inspiring to sit with people in the way that I do, in these therapeutic relationships where people are working on this proactively, actively, taking responsibility and accountability and moving through difficulties and issues in their life and in relationships. But I think it is important to have patience. We are pattern forming as human beings. Change takes time. It's often in small steps. Change occurs. It's incremental as well. It can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not linear, but I do think it needs to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, not no steps at all or steps back. I mean, just to say on the subject of patience and really working with someone, if say that's in a romantic relationship, through all this together, is that I do get people who I think have those highly narcissistic traits who might be made to come in to therapy by another person. And for them, the goalposts have changed in some ways. They did the protect, they did the provide, and that is what someone may have gone to them for. That's what somebody found appealing in them, perhaps filled in the blanks with love and imagination there, just assumed the more loving qualities were there, or didn't even notice because what they were taking care of was their protection need and their provide need. And then, of course, once they get into the relationship and those needs are met, as I've just said, as with all human beings, I think we automatically sort of move up to those more connection and loving needs, and that's when somebody might notice a deficit in their partner. But of course, for their partner, they never offered anything more than that. In some ways, they're shocked. This isn't to make an excuse for anything, but I do think it's some people's experience. They think, well, I protect and I provide. It was never on the table that I love. in a way that was truly loving. And as I say, none of that is making excuses for anything or suggesting that somebody should tolerate less love than they deserve in life or need in life. It's just from a kind of patience point of view. But going back to what I said earlier, it's patience as long as somebody is reflecting on self, being curious, really engaging in that journey themselves. There is that process of change, isn't there? That people go from, not that I would use these words myself, but well, I am to a degree, but I wouldn't have come up with this. But people need to go from being unconsciously incompetent about something to consciously incompetent, then to consciously competent, and then to unconsciously competent. So there are those stages of change, and that includes if we're looking at bringing more empathy, for example, into life and moving these red flags out and moving green flags in. It is a process of change. If two people really earn that together on their own journeys within the relationship, I think that can be incredible from the point of view of the connection that those two people are going to experience together. And having just said all that, moving on to 10 and leaving a situation, another thing which I have seen in my work, but it's anecdotal, is that some people, with all of the opportunity and the time and the money and living in environments where we hear so much talk about relationships and narcissism and gaslighting and red flags, and so many people are much more psychologically minded, where some people, even though that may not have been up until now where they've been, they have absolutely the opportunity from a time point of view, from a money point of view, from support from the people around them, including companies, corporates, employee assistance programs, time off to go to therapy, all those. I'm not suggesting there isn't any stigma for some people around it, of course, but I don't think ever before has there been more support for people looking at their own patterns and looking at how they relate and making change psychologically and emotionally in life. But there are some people, despite all of that, and they may pay lip service to it, but 1 year is going to turn into 3 years, is going to turn into 5, and is going to turn into 10, because they are never going to do it. And there are people that actively, proactively reject it in therapy. They hear about it all, we talk about it, and they just say, no, that's not what they want to spend their time, money doing. And a couple of things there. If somebody has very narcissistic traits, there is a huge secondary gain in lots of environments to having those traits up high from the point of view of material status and wealth. There's a real halo effect that comes with those things for human beings generally. If somebody thinks their capacity and ability to earn more money and go for this status is going to be compromised perhaps by therapy, in some ways there's a disincentive for them to do it, but that's only a disincentive if they value material status, wealth, the current status quo, if that's what the narcissistic person is doing, above their relationships, their relationship with themselves and empathy for themselves, and also their relationships with others. So some people have no intention of changing, despite everything will not. And I think if that's the person we're in a relationship with, you know, our life is all we have. Daylight's fading for all of us. Ultimately, we can love someone and not be with them in a romantic relationship or another kind of relationship. We don't have to anymore orbit around somebody who's narcissistic. Some people, I believe, are better left untrusted in that way. As I say, it doesn't mean they wouldn't be in your life in some other way, but if you're looking at a relationship where there's some expectation of genuinely being loved, where you need that love and support and want to give it, some people are better left untrusted in that context. And there's nobody in life that you can't live without in that way. Again, I'm not in any way promoting or suggesting that people ought to or have to leave. I think that's something that is worked out by paying attention to our own emotional experience and thoughts, and also talking to trusted others. But I just want to, to hold in mind that a truly lived life is a loved one, and I mean really loved. And that the best experiences in life are good relationships. And if that is something that through a process of change just isn't happening, maybe it is at some point time to move on so that you can then go and live a truly lived life. Okay, so lots to say there. I hope it's been helpful and interesting for you. As ever, with any of these 3 videos, I would love to hear what you think, any of your views about anything that I've said, anything you might want to hear more about, or if you disagree, or there's something you would like to add, please do that either below the videos, or also you can contact me separately via my website. Please do like the video if you have found it helpful. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and of course share the video to anybody else if you think they would find it helpful. Thank you for listening and watching, and do take care, and I shall see you again soon.